again, it's in the eye of the beholder. And for those that have the capacity to save and have that long-term mindset, Bitcoin is profound. Bitcoin has shown that through any 4-year period, it has never lost money. And so I think that the long-term volatility of Bitcoin is in our favor. That's positive volatility.
All right, so I made the classic rookie error of not recording from the beginning, and Seb, you came out the gates with some real gold. If you don't mind just repeating that last point that you made to me, because I think it's something that's really understated, I think, in Bitcoin circles, and people don't necessarily understand it.
Well, I would say that I've had like a profound year. I feel so honored and grateful given that when I released the Hidden Cost of Money, it's kind of opened up these doors. I've been able to go and speak to some phenomenal individuals, people that have massively helped me on my own personal educational journey. And I've been able to go to like Madeira and speak at these conferences. But one thing that has really kind of piqued my interest or kind of have raised more awareness to is the fact that when I listen to myself and who I am as an individual, I realize how much of a homebody I am and how much I value having my space and having my routines. And so as much as I feel so grateful and honored to be able to travel and to be overseas and to meet these phenomenal individuals, more and more I'm realizing how much like I want to be at home and I like to be in my routines. And yeah, so that's
That's
who
a
I am. And
great
it's important
point.
to listen.
I love it, man. I love it because it's exactly the same for me. I do my sort of little bits of travel around here in Australia. We'll go to the odd conference here and there. And whenever I'm flying back into Brisbane, I'm like, woo, let's get home. And then even once I'm in Brisbane, it's like, not the whole of Brisbane is chilled, but I live in a chilled part. And so I get sort of 30 Ks out of the city and I'm like, oh boy, I love this. This makes me so happy. And it's 100% true. So, a lot of people glamorize the nomad life, and I don't think you're necessarily doing that at all. I think what you're saying is so true. I mean, like, what an opportunity to go and chat to all these folks and go speak at conferences. And honestly, if I had half the chance, I'd jump at those opportunities. But there's nothing quite like being at home. And so it does make you actually start thinking about, well, where do you want to live? So let's start with that. You're one of the Bitcoin Canadians that I've been wanting to ask the question of like, what is going on there? Because during the pandemic, Australia and Canada were competing really hard to see who could be more draconian and authoritarian. And I don't know who won actually in the end, but for some other reason, Canadians felt that they needed to award Mr. Justin Trudeau with a second term. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of like what is going on in Canada as far as you're concerned. There's also now apparently a proposed $25,000 sort of penalty, you could call it, for if you want to sort of leave the country and immigrate. Is it a case of like everything's going to hell in Canada, or are there little pockets where you can actually, insulate yourself from all the madness, and you can actually do that in Australia too?
You know, it's a challenging one because I think that no matter where you are in the world, things can turn so quickly that I think that, yes, I could, if I wanted to go move overseas, I could go move to El Salvador, I could go move to New Zealand. I have a New Zealand passport, lucky enough. But the reality is that given that we put a lot of weight in politics, the scary thing is no matter how free a country may seem at the moment, in the next political cycle, it can turn so quickly. And that turn can be both positive or it could be negative. And we've seen, obviously, in El Salvador, that turn has been incredibly positive. We have seen Bitcoin adoption increase there. We have seen much more freedom in some ways. But then at the same time, Alex Gladstein pushed back and say, well, a lot of these criminals have been just put in jail and they've just been completely shut off the streets, whether they have actually been kind of accused of crimes or not. So bring it back to Canada. What is so challenging for me is that the environment of Canada there is nowhere else I'd rather be. The mountains, the ski resorts, the people. I love this place. I absolutely love this place. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. But the political side of things is increasingly infringing upon our rights and freedoms. And I think this is the perfect example of when a country becomes so heavily indebted, which Canada, when you look at debt in comparison to GDP, it's the second worst in the world behind Japan. So what you start to realize is that when a country is very heavily indebted, all of a sudden it has to increasingly infringe upon rights and freedoms to prevent capital flight, to prevent people from moving, because it has to keep capital inside of the borders so it can devalue the currency and keep funding operations, keep limping along. And it's scary because we are trending towards more of an authoritarian, a totalitarian, more controlling structure. And we see that increasingly. And of course, it's not a Mao Zedong yet. It's not a Hitler or a Stalin, but they're these slow little incremental movements. And so, as you mentioned, we've seen over, especially the last few weeks, I think the capital gains inclusion rate has just increased from 50% inclusion rate to 66.7 or something like that. So we're starting to see these slow infringements on our ability to show up as individuals, to spend our capital where we see fit. More dollars are going towards taxation, you name it.
And I think one of the things that it's worth considering when evaluating Canada or any country for that matter is just the broader context. So there's no solutions, only trade-offs. I did a presentation on this very topic this last year in at Palm Cove with your mate Daz. Effectively, I came to this conclusion that when you look at Australia, all things considered, I was of the opinion it actually made sense for me where I am right now in my life because, you start at the sort of bottom of the Maslow hierarchy of needs and you kind of go, I want a place where I can actually feel physically safe. I mean, you don't actually have freedom if you don't have physical safety. And so, that's just the first layer. And then beyond that, you start wanting to think about things like, the climate, economic opportunities, cultural adaptation. Can you actually fit in? I mean, it's nice, maybe the cost of living is half in some sort of rural village in Japan, but is that really going to be fulfilling long term, as an example? And we start just going down all these different layers. And then you realize, actually, there's not that many options. There really aren't, particularly if you're an English speaking individual and you don't see yourself actually ever becoming intertwined with some other type of culture or language. It really is pretty taxing. I mean, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the US, they all have similar characteristics. Great Britain, they have pros and cons. But I think for me, one of the major things I learned about myself was the environment. I love having good weather. It's something that I've migrated to on the East Coast in Australia because I thought I can't live in a place where it's windy and I'm miserable outside. Like every time I go for a walk, I'm getting blown over and I'm just furious. So those are the kinds of things you'll learn. But yeah, I think, when I zoom out, Seb, I think there's no real solutions here. And it's particularly the case probably that we also, once we've got family and friends and a network and a community, and then you add sort of children into the mix, it makes it that much harder just for you to extract yourself and say, oh, well, I'll go live in El Salvador because I think it's a lot more complex than that. But yeah,
Absolutely. And we've seen, like, even you just take a look at how quick, like, given that, what was it, 2021 when Bitcoin became legal tender in El Salvador, look how much change has happened in that time from 2021 to 2024. But it could have easily been the reverse, which we've obviously seen in Canada, we've seen in Australia, we've seen in a few other nations. And so the thing that is so challenging is I could move to El Salvador, and then the same happens to El Salvador where we get someone elected that's not Bukele and we lean more socialist, we get more intervention, we see more infringement, and vice versa. Where Canada, we see Pierre Poilievre, who's kind of the runner-up of the Conservative Party. Let's just say, what if he gets elected and all of a sudden we start to see more greater Bitcoin adoption, reduction in taxes, you name it. The challenge is, which I would say, is that I do believe increasingly that democracy no longer holds its weight. Unfortunately, there are certain incentives of the system that whether you're voting left or you're voting right, whether you're voting Republican, Democratic, Labour, Conservative, unfortunately, the incentives of the system are that because of how much debt we have, they're increasingly incentivized to intervene. So whether you're voting for a more socialist or government or a more conservative government, both of them are incentivized to intervene because unfortunately, we're not moving into a period like a world war where unfortunately you can push austerity because the populace wants to stand behind it and say, hey, we want to live within our means so we can help support our country go to war, such as what happened in World War II. We're not at that point anymore. Unfortunately, we have so much wealth inequality, we have so much social unrest, and a lot of people are anti-war that if the government was to come out and say, hey, we're going to go into austerity in order to be able to pay back some of this debt or live within our means, people would just be like, we're not seeing any benefits of this anyway. There's massive amounts of wealth inequality. We feel like this money is being funneled to the elite as it is. So it's very hard for us to move into a period of austerity, which then means that, well, what is the answer? The answer is just more money printing. The answer is more just kicking the can down the road, which increases social unrest, increases wealth inequality. So it's tough. We're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, which I think leads to more and more intervention more and more kind of control in most nations, which is what we are seeing.
Yeah. And sort of what you're kind of hinting at is that fundamentally democracy is optimized for short-term outcomes, which are not necessarily going to be beneficial to the populace. However, they
Mhm.
will help them get re-elected or elected, as the case may be. Something that I've been grappling with a fair bit, and I think this sort of can segue nicely here into your new book, which you were actually writing when we last spoke. So I'm really pleased that you did that, and it's a monumental effort, and it's been so well received. And I'm really proud of your efforts, man. Well done. The hidden cost of money. To what extent do you think politics plays a role in our broken monetary system? And I'll kind of preface this by saying, are there periods in history where we had sound money, where things were actually operating relatively well, where there might have been some inequality, but people felt, well, it wasn't unjustified in the sense of they do today, how badly skewed it is? Because my view is, I try to push back on Jeff Booth when I had a conversation with him last week. I haven't released that yet. And I was unsuccessful because my view was just that people will always find a way to draw a wedge between people, and inequality is the natural state of man, or humankind, if you like, or people kind, as Justin Trudeau would say. But it's just the natural state of being, and that there's always going to be someone who can rebel around and say, hey, look at these people, they actually benefit at your expense. And so, sound money or not, the political systems are such that there always will be this inequality, and it's not just
Mhm.
because of money. I don't know. What's your sense of that situation I just described?
Well, the first thing I would say is that inequality in itself is not bad. I think you're always going to get people that are striving for more and people that can't be asked and are happy to live maybe a bit more of a lazy existence. And so inequality in itself is not bad. And this is where I think what is important to push for is not necessarily equality, but equality of opportunity. And I think that what I love about Bitcoin is the fact that it's a system built upon rules instead of rulers. Everyone plays by the same rules. So we've all got the same, we've got equality of opportunity. And that allows us as an individual, if I want to strive, if I want to start a business and try and be successful, then frick, I can go and do that. But at the same time, if I want to kind of live a bit more of a lazy existence, when we have a free market that allows for competition, and at the same time, everyone is playing by the same rules, then we all benefit from the free market and their ability to increase productivity, increase efficiency, increase technology. The challenge we face at the moment is that our monetary system enables those in positions of power to take advantage of the working class, take advantage of everybody through monetary debasement, so that we're basically funding these massive deficits for the government. And kind of that's at a very high level. But what's interesting is the way I kind of tend to look at money and why we have fallen into the positions at which we are in, and I explain this in the book, is there's something when you look at how an economy functions, there's something called the four factors of production. And the four factors of production basically explain the four areas that make up an economy. So you've got land, you've got, well, obviously trees, you've got the oil in the ground, you've got the minerals, all the resources that make up all of our goods and services. You've then got labor. Labor is obviously our ability as individuals to come together to add our time, sweat, and tears to be able to create value. You've then got capital. Capital is the ability to buy goods and services and then stimulate the economy. And then finally, you've got enterprise, which is kind of all these three: land, labor, and capital combined together to create technology, innovation, you name it, that helps move society forward. But the challenge is that out of these four levers, three of them are indirect. So land, labor, and capital. So land, if we want to try and create change in our economy through land, we've got to find gold, we've got to find all these resources. We've got so much red tape because of the environmental movement that it's so hard to find resources. Not only that, but we've scoured this earth for resources, which makes it very hard to create change through resources. What about labor? We have aging demographics in most countries. We have an aging population, which means that our labor workforce is getting older, which is less productive. We've got to support the elderly population that are retiring, which means that if we've got a huge debt burden, and then all of a sudden you've got less people working, who's going to be supporting that debt burden? So we could have more kids, but again, that takes time. To have more kids to lower the average age of the workforce takes a long time. And then finally, you've got the enterprise lever. Enterprise, again, you can create technology, you can create change through technology and innovation, but it takes time. And when it comes to AI, we've been talking about AI since the 70s, and it's only now just starting to create change. And so it's one of those things where you can't just create immediate change in the economy through AI, which leaves us with one lever left, and that's the monetary lever, the capital lever. The government has recognized over hundreds and hundreds of years that if it wants to create change in the economy, all it needs to do is pull the capital lever, inject money into the economy, and it creates immediate growth and change, whether that growth is good. And the problem with that is it's created an incentive whereby the government is incentivized to pull the capital lever to stimulate the economy when times are tough. But as we know, by stimulating the economy when the times are tough, trying to treat the symptom as opposed to the root, it leads us down this whole rabbit hole. And so over time, money has centralized, given that it's the easiest lever to pull, if that kind of makes sense. And so I think that going back to your question about politics and money, I think that the way our economy functions at the moment, because money is so malleable, because money has been physical throughout nature, throughout history, and it has easily been controlled and co-opted, we have trended towards the centralization of money and the monetary lever being used as the primary way to create change in the economy. But that has also led us to where we are now, where we have immense amounts of debt because we've been pulling the monetary lever. We've been trying to create change through just the monetary lever. And now we have an aging population. We have a massive amount of debt. We have scoured the earth for resources. We have a consumption-based economy. And we've got massive wealth inequality and people are struggling. And so I think what Bitcoin does for the first time ever in history is it allows us to remove money from the clutches of government. Gold tried to do that, but unfortunately, because of gold's physical nature, it had to be stored in a physical location. Someone had to count it and make sure that the unit of currency matched the amount of gold in deposit. But that was obviously not the case in time. They took advantage of that. So with Bitcoin, for the first time, we can separate money from state. We can allow money to exist on its own. So we no longer have that monetary lever. If we want to create change, we have to create change through land, labor, and enterprise, and not money. Sorry, that was a bit of a roundabout response to your question.
Would you say, though, that in general, I mean, democracy is generally viewed as being the best of all the bad systems that exist there? Like, I don't know too many people who'd want to live under a monarchy or some sort of dictatorship. And if we take an example like Bukele, he might be doing right by 99% of the population, but from someone who has your background, I believe in due process and the idea of just being able to sort of scrape up anyone who's affiliated with the gang, irrespective of whether you've done anything, and just sort of locking people up without going to trial, just strikes me as unfair. In a democracy, I feel like we're incentivized to do whatever is necessary to ensure that we retain power, whatever that might be. Often that is, as you say, sort of injecting capital into the economy. I get all sorts of stimulus that I don't even know about, like on my electricity bill. It's a cost of living sort of bit of assistance, like a rebate. And I'm like, well, I know who's paying for that eventually. It's not like just free. And then you've got like a monarchy, which to me, is, again, like I don't like monarchies per se, like what made you so special, but they seem more incentivized to think long term. Do you not think that there's maybe a case to be made that actually, like under like a monarchy, there would be, I guess, more incentive to think long term, less incentive to do short term things at like fixing the symptoms and not the underlying cause? You can imagine like Queen Elizabeth getting in front of people and say, right, things are not going well. We've got a bit of a problem here, we're on it. And they love her for some other reason in the UK. And imagine that she could get everyone to rally behind some sort of austerity, assuming that you didn't have a prime minister or that. That seems more plausible to me, Seb. I don't know. So I don't think it discounts what you're saying. I just feel like I keep thinking the way that we construct our politics has just made it so easy for us to lean towards this easy, cheap, fiat debt-based system.
Absolutely.
More real.
Absolutely. And what I think is challenging is the fact that there is no perfect panacea and there is no solution. Every single system, whether it's a democracy, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's an authoritarian government, ultimately everyone has trade-offs. And what I do believe, though, is that no matter what the system is, I think that the power needs to retain in the hands of the people so that you can actually hold those who are in the elite or the ruling class accountable. And I think the challenge that we face right now is that, unfortunately, when you have a monetary system that is under, say, the state or even the monarchy, whether it's the UK or whether it's Canada or the US, unfortunately, you have the ability to run deficits. And so these individuals, these people in positions of power, can run deficits without actually having to listen to the populace. They don't actually have to act on behalf of the populace. Whereas I think when you look under, say, the Austrian economic approach, it is that by separating money from state and having a monetary system that is allows to represent maybe more of the free market, the natural societal order of what it is that we value in society, what that means is that those in positions of power, if the only way that they can fund operation is through taxation, and all of a sudden the populace do not agree with what those in positions of power are doing, then all of a sudden, if they stop paying taxes, then those in positions of power can no longer fund operations and they'll quickly wither away. And so you're actually forcing a free market. And this is what I think Bitcoin does, is I'm not against, I don't actually believe in anarchy. I don't believe in moving towards some form of like kind of self-defense mechanism where we have to kind of put ourselves out there and defend our family with guns. I do believe that the state does hold a position. It's just at the moment, I think, unfortunately, our system has allowed the state to slowly engross and encompass a large portion of our general populace. Like you even look at job growth in the public sector versus the private sector, because they have a monetary printer, because they can fund operations without support from the populace. The average private public sector job in Canada and the US pays 10% above the private sector, which means the public sector is slowly engulfing the private sector because the private sector simply cannot compete. When you're competing against someone with a money printer, it's impossible. You're not competing on value creation. You're competing on freaking that person's got a money printer. And so I think going back to your point, I think many of these systems have benefits, whether it is a monarchy, whether it is a democracy. However, I think that you have to put certain measures in place that limit and put bounds on their ability to overreach. And I think the first step to that is the separation of money and state, money and monarchy, whatever that looks like, because all of a sudden it forces a free market operation. It allows for, if the government in power is not offering value to the populace, they'll slowly wither away. And one that listens to the populace, one that does offer value, has the capacity to then rise up. And I believe that is important. That's a personal belief.
100%. I think one of the signs that I'll be looking out for in terms of from a jurisdictional arbitrage perspective, when you're talking about collecting passports, residencies, where's the next sort of land of milk and honey, is where the public sector is actually getting smaller. And I'm encouraged by what's happening in Argentina, and I hope that sort of sentiment spreads throughout the region. But generally speaking, the sector only gets bigger. It doesn't seem to ever sort of shrink because it's not accountable to market forces.
Not accountable. Absolutely.
And they're not actually incentivized to actually fix problems. I've spoken about this on the show before, but you've got this whole sort of homeless industrial complex in San Francisco, people that are literally on the payroll just to solve the homelessness problem, but they don't actually solve it unless Xi Jinping's coming to town, because that's their job. They've got 50 or 100 people that are getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to quote unquote solve the problem. But if they actually did solve the problem, there wouldn't be this department in the first place. And it's exactly what you say, in the sense that if governments had to balance their balance sheets as we do, as households, as individuals, I think the outcomes would be so different. I mean, you certainly would have a situation where you're giving Ukraine 70 or 90 billion dollars for its war efforts, when most of the population is like, we're against this. We've got a lot of domestic problems, guys. So it really does speak to how the broken money does distort things, and how your ability to print it can result in effectively the lawmakers and policy makers being completely disconnected from the populace, the will of the people.
Yeah.
And they forget that they actually work for us and they don't care.
I couldn't agree more. And talking about kind of this distortion of things, in my book, I was thinking about maybe how I see money. And one of the ways that I kind of try to articulate it is that money, like language, is just a medium of expression. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value as individuals. And the analogy I give is that, like, if you walk into a grocery store and you see someone buying organic vegetables and grass-fed beef, and then you see another person buying cigarettes and microwave meals, you can see their values being shown by how they spend their capital, spend their money, the hard-earned money that they've earned. But unfortunately, like language, we also face censorship. And so things like inflation, where our purchasing power is diminishing, our cost of living is rising, that is a form of censorship, because it makes it harder for us to show up how we want to show up and how we want to express ourselves. And so money that we have worked hard to earn all of a sudden purchases less. And then we're also seeing things like capital controls. When you've got, say, a country like China, if you as an individual want to support your family because you're seeing that the government is not being fiscally responsible, so you think, okay, you know what, I want to move my capital overseas. Well, all of a sudden, capital controls prevent you from doing so. You can't express yourself how you want to. And the problem with that is if you've got a nation that is very pro-war and they want to devalue the currency and they go fund war, well, all of a sudden, your purchasing power is being taken and spent in the form of war. So on a high level, it looks like, hey, this populace is very pro-war. That's not the case. You just have a government that is pro-war and they have the capacity to debase the currency. And so it distorts the view of society. We no longer have an idea about who is actually creating value in society. What is it that society actually wants and wants to spend its capital towards? And I think that is the challenge we face today, is that it's very hard for central planners to even make important economic decisions because we don't actually know what it is that society values. We don't know where capital would naturally flow in a free market.
Absolutely. Amen. Seb, that's great. Because, capital controls is something that we're all too familiar with in South Africa. I mean, literally, there are very strict capital controls of what you can take in and out of the country, or mostly out, really. It hasn't been indexed for quite some time. So just by virtue of the passing of time, more and more people's transfers fall within the capital net. And then we've also got a situation where you can't invest more than 25% of your retirement. There's various different types of pension fund schemes, but you can't invest more than 25% in international equities. So they effectively want you to invest in the local stock exchange and in government bonds, which is another form of capital control. And it then does distort what people actually want, as you say, because we're not able to properly express ourselves. And again, that to me feels like a form of censorship, because I want to look at my time as stored energy and I want to be able to plan for the future. And you're not allowing me to do so by virtue of these arbitrary rules. Anyway, I'd love to touch on a few other things, but I really like how you've put it there, the censorship piece. And it's something that's just clicked to my mind, which I really appreciate. I'd love to now touch on a few FUD-busting things, because I have been chatting to folks at work in my Fiat Live about Bitcoin, even so much so that, I'm sort of banging on about it after meetings. I actually dreamt about it last night, me talking to all my colleagues. Like, I don't know why I feel this compulsion, but then there's always this like wave of just questions and skepticism. And so much of it is, I guess, rooted, and I think quite correctly, in the idea of them just not understanding things. And so while we as Bitcoiners might have done the work, we might have actually gone and said, like, I've gone through each of these criticisms or questions that people have. I think this segment of today's discussion could be useful for people who are talking to friends or family and don't necessarily have that answer ready, in the sense of, how do I explain this briefly, succinctly, and in a way that will stick and resonate? It's not going to be helpful to say, go read the Bitcoin Standard. Like, a lot of people don't like reading, so that's right out, But I'd love for us just to touch on it, and we can do it in a relatively rapid fire way. I went and ran through a bunch last night because I got triggered by something I saw online. There was this woman who was chatting with this freedom fighter, this Scottish fella, and she was just rattling off all this garbage. And at the end said something about the XRP army, and my brain exploded. So I was like, we need to talk. Okay, so with all that said, the first thing people want to know is, how do you actually value this thing? Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, Seb. How do we respond to that particular issue?
So the first thing I would say is, and there's kind of two ways to approach this. The first thing is, value is subjective. Nothing in the world has intrinsic value. If you have, let's say, a down jacket and you're living in the Arctic, well, that down jacket is worth a hell of a lot. That's ultimately, without that down jacket, you're probably going to die. So the reason why that down jacket has value is because of the utility it provides. If you have that same down jacket and you're in the Sahara Desert and it's freaking 50 degrees out, and so that utility is almost zero. And so when people say Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, the way that I kind of tend to think about it is, well, then you probably benefit from the current system. You're probably benefiting from the current system. So of course it has no value to you as an individual. But if you're living, let's say, underneath an authoritarian regime that has got capital controls in place, that is monitoring your transactions, preventing you from spending capital where you see fit, debasing your currency, all of a sudden, having a permissionless, trustless, and decentralized currency, a way to be able to send money without kind of overlookers, third parties, and to be able to send it in a permissionless manner, that utility is huge. And so value is in the eye of the beholder. It is based upon the utility that whatever it is provides to us as individuals. You can also say the same with art. Art looks like, well, it's got no intrinsic value. The Mona Lisa has no intrinsic value. No, but if you own the Mona Lisa, all of a sudden the utility to you as an individual may be that it allows you access to certain social groups or certain elite individuals, or it makes you feel good about yourself that you've got an ancient painting. So I think that it's really important to step back and realize that nothing has intrinsic value. It is purely based upon the subjectivity of value and what utility that thing provides to us. The second kind of way you can approach that question about the valuation of Bitcoin is looking at the fact that money today is meant to serve three functions: a store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account. Let's forget about the second two and just focus on the first one, a store of value. Today, money no longer serves as a store of value. We're getting constant inflation, prices are rising. All of a sudden, people don't just go and keep their purchasing power in the currency. What do they go and do? They go and flood into assets to go and store purchasing power. So they go flood into real estate, they go and flood into equities, they go and flood into bonds. And so we're seeing all of these asset prices skyrocket. And people are saying, oh, there's a bubble in equities. Oh, there's a bubble in real estate. There's not a bubble in these asset classes. There's a broken monetary system that doesn't allow us to store value in the currency. Now, the reality is that when you look at, say, real estate, well, real estate has probably around 300, I believe, don't quote me on this, around $300 trillion of capital stored in real estate globally. The equity market is around $150 trillion. The bond market is another $250 to $300 trillion. The derivatives market, so options, futures, you name it, that's something like $1 quadrillion of capital stored in these assets. And the reason why that capital is in those assets is because the money does not serve as a store of value. Because if it did, people would simply save in the currency. So when we look at Bitcoin, what does Bitcoin do? Bitcoin offers utility in the fact that there's a fixed supply, which means as technology advances, as productivity increases, well, prices are going to start falling in relation to Bitcoin. Now, what is fascinating, and this kind of blows my mind, is that if you actually take a look at the advancement in technology, prices should be falling at around 5 to 15% per year. So let's just take the middle ground of that, 10%. Well, how does that stack up against real estate, equities, and bonds? Well, real estate over the last 100 years has annualized around 6 to 7%. Bonds have annualized kind of 4.5 to kind of 6.5%, and equities have annualized around 8 to 9% over the last kind of 100 years. What you then realize is that if we had a currency that had a fixed supply that allowed us to store value, if prices should be falling at kind of around 10% per year, well, all of a sudden, the currency outperforms all of these traditional asset classes, which means capital would flood from those asset classes back into the currency. So when people say, well, Bitcoin is kind of worthless, why is Bitcoin worth anything? Well, Bitcoin is a store of value. Bitcoin is something that has a fixed supply. Bitcoin is something that allows us to transact in a permissionless, trustless way, decentralized, removes middlemen, you name it. There's so many benefits to Bitcoin, but ultimately, Bitcoin is a currency that allows us to store value. It acts as a store of value. And I think what would happen is we would slowly see a lot of this capital fly out of these traditional asset classes back into the currency, simply because our current monetary system does not allow us to store value in the currency. Bitcoin is kind of the reverse of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what you're implying there is Bitcoin is a monetary good, which is sort of distinct from companies where you can value them based on cash flows. And it's distinct from other types of commodities, even though it is classified as a digital commodity, in the sense that those commodities get used to produce some sort of higher order goods. Whereas Bitcoin is kind of different, and its value is determined in a game theoretic sense by participants in the market, sort of looking, okay, what do I value at? What do other people think it's valued at? And for those reasons, like what you've just described, the censorship resistance piece and the ability to effectively preserve purchasing power over time and space. Bitcoin volatility, this is always a big one, but it's up and down, and you can kind of say, yeah, zoom out, have a look at the halvings, and have a look and see, have a look at the log chart. But fundamentally, like, people struggled with this idea of volatility. So talk to us about how you address that particular issue. And I'm particularly sympathetic to this issue, Seb, because the later you are towards your so-called retirement age, and some people don't want to retire, but that's another matter, the less of an appetite you have for that volatility. I mean, it wouldn't be ideal. I understand the inclination towards having a little bit more stability, less volatility as you get older. But talk to us just about how you address that volatility piece, because that's a big one.
Absolutely. And again, this one is it's tough because, to your point, everyone kind of looks at Bitcoin differently, and we have different use cases for Bitcoin. Some people are purely using it as a speculative asset, so they don't mind the volatility. Other people may be looking at it as a pension portfolio piece, and so that volatility is detrimental. And so I think that it's incredibly important to recognize that everyone has a unique need, and so Bitcoin may not meet everyone's unique need. However, in saying that, the first thing I should say is, why are we seeing this volatility, and is volatility a bad thing? And there's, again, two different ways you can kind of approach this. The first is that we have immense adoption in Bitcoin. Bitcoin right now, I don't know, the market cap is probably around 1 trillion, a little more than 1 trillion US dollars. As I was just describing when we're talking about the value of Bitcoin, right now we're seeing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars stored in these traditional asset classes, simply because our monetary system, our fiat currencies, don't act as a store of value. So if we had a monetary system that allowed us to store value, we could see hundreds of trillions of dollars flood back into Bitcoin. Now, yes, that's going to make it incredibly volatile as capital is fleeing traditional assets and moving into Bitcoin. But that volatility is to the upside, where we're seeing our purchasing power increase over time. That fluctuation, yes, it makes it hard sometimes to plan. You don't know what Bitcoin's price is going to be in a week's time or a month's time. But hopefully that means we have greater clarity that in a year's time, 5 years' time, we're probably going to have increased purchasing power. And then on top of that, this volatility also is not necessarily a problem of Bitcoin, but the volatility is actually a problem with the unit of account. The unit of account at the moment is the US dollar or these fiat currencies. We're measuring Bitcoin against fiat currency. And what's interesting is that the reason why Bitcoin's price is volatile is because when we have central bankers that are constantly performing quantitative easing, adding money into the economy, and then quantitative tightening, pulling money out of the economy, all of a sudden Bitcoin and these risk assets are responding to the easing and tightening of monetary supply. And so people are like, well, Bitcoin's volatile. But what that's actually highlighting is, no, fiat is volatile, because fiat is causing people to flood in and out of Bitcoin based upon the fiat monetary system, the central bankers. So sometimes it's a misnomer when people say these asset classes are volatile. What's interesting is when you actually take a look at gold, pre-departure from the gold standard, gold was far more stable. And then the moment we departed from the gold standard, we moved to the fiat standard, gold became a lot more volatile, because it's highlighting that when we're using gold as the unit of account, we're no longer seeing these inflows and outflows as a result of the fiat system, which is kind of the problem that we see with Bitcoin. And then the other point that I kind of will make, which is to your point, is volatility. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder. If you're living in a developing country and you need security of purchasing power, so you need to feed your family, you don't have the capacity to save, then I wholeheartedly agree that your best bet may not be Bitcoin for your immediate need for purchases. If you need to feed your family and you need to know that you've got $50 in your bank account to feed your family for the next week or 2 weeks, then Bitcoin can have price swings of 10, 20, 30% on kind of the grander scheme of things. And that is scary. And that's where I think Bitcoin in the short term may not meet the needs of those individuals. However, I think in the long term, and for those that have the capacity to save and have that long-term mindset, Bitcoin is profound. Bitcoin has shown that through any 4-year period, it has never lost money. And so I think that the long-term volatility of Bitcoin is in our favor. That's positive volatility. Price is moving in our favor, our purchasing power is increasing.
Yes. And I suppose there's a couple of points that you touched on there. Circular economies and everyone paying in Bitcoin. I've always thought, I love the idea of a grassroots movement. I always just wonder in practice how useful it is in some ways, because the shopkeepers are still having to go and price their goods in fiat. And so because of Bitcoin's volatility relative to fiat, if we're using fiat as the denominator, you could be paying 20% more for this thing today, 20% less. But yes, I agree, over time, there is actually no better way for you to store your value. In fact, over any 4-year period, the lowest return we've ever seen is 100%. That's just pick any 2 data points in Bitcoin's history.
Well, and it's interesting because I notice, like, I try to live as much as I can on a Bitcoin standard. But day to day, naturally, when I walk into the store, obviously everything is priced in Canadian dollars. And so for small purchases, I'm still thinking in Canadian dollars. It's kind of frustrating to kind of constantly think, okay, how much is that in sats or how much is that in Bitcoin? But when I start thinking about purchases above a couple $1,000s, my mind is thinking in Bitcoin terms, because I start to think about the opportunity cost of purchasing something that is $3, $4, $5+ thousand in relation to, if I purchase Bitcoin, Well, what happens in 4 years' time, 5 years' time, you name it?
I usually do a little exercise where I 10x what I'm going to spend, and if I'm happy with the price, then I'll do it. At the moment, I've got my eye on some sort of noise cancelling headphones. Mine have had a really rough run. They still function. They look like hell, but I can't bring myself to actually pull the trigger because I think they're about like $500 Aussie. So I'm like, that's a 5 grand. I don't know if I'm okay with that. But yeah, and the last thing I'll say on the sort of volatility piece is something that Peter Dunwich is quite well known for, is that volatility and risk are not the same thing. So people in TradFi tend to equate volatility with risk, but they're very distinct in the sense that it is volatile for the reasons you've described. Money's coming in and out of the fiat system into Bitcoin, but it's an emergent money. And so it is volatile to both the upside and downside. You don't get the sun without the rain, as it were, but you can't equate volatility with risk because it's not as if there's, I think at this point, a risk of capital destruction. In the short term, you
Hmm.
might see net worth diminish, but I think for the most part, I don't know anyone credible who believes that Bitcoin can actually will disappear. I think it's too well established.
Totally. And I'll add one point quickly, which is like in traditional finance, a lot of people measure a portfolio's success by what's called the Sharpe ratio. The Sharpe ratio obviously takes into account volatility. But the interesting thing is they don't distinguish between both positive volatility, as in price increasing, versus negative volatility, price declining. And so that you can have a portfolio that over the long run has massively outperformed another portfolio, but its Sharpe ratio is lower because that increase in price has negatively impacted the portfolio Sharpe ratio. And so I recommend not necessarily, if you're in the traditional finance space, don't look at the Sharpe ratio when it comes to Bitcoin. Instead, there are other metrics. There's one called the Sortino ratio, which only takes into account volatility from the downside. And so it ignores any upside volatility, which means it's a fair gauge because you don't want to take into account if something's increasing in price, that volatility is not a negative. That is a positive to the portfolio. And so it's only taking into account and negatively impacting the portfolio if it's seeing a lot of downside volatility.
Great point. Okay, awesome. I've seen the Sortino ratio, but I've never actually really dabbled with it. So great point there, Seb. Something that's come up a lot, and this is partly what inspired this segment, was there's a lot of people, particularly the crypto bros, they have all the incentives to say this, but Bitcoin cannot scale. It's too slow. It only can do 7 transactions per second, Seb. It's broken. It doesn't work as money.
Again, I think that there is no perfect solution. There's only trade-offs. And if we try to scale on the main chain or kind of the base layer of Bitcoin, there's going to be huge trade-offs. And so just to quickly kind of summarize, we had this thing called the block size wars a ways back. I think it was in 2016, 2017. And so the block size wars were effectively, do we want to increase the amount of transaction throughput or the amount of transactions that can be processed on the base chain? Because at the moment, it's around kind of 7 transactions per second. I think it's a little more than that now that we've got a few more adaptations to the code. But let's just say it, 7 seconds, 7 transactions per second at the moment. They want to try and increase that. So how do you do that? Well, if a block size is 1 megabyte right now, well, what if we increase the block size to 5 megabytes or 6 megabytes or 10 megabytes? You can start to shove more transactions in so we can start to increase the amount of transactions. The challenge with that is that as we start to increase the size of the block, that means that the blockchain is going to bloat, it's going to swell. So as an individual, if I want to run a node, instead of the blockchain consuming a couple 100 megabytes of space every single year, it's going to start consuming hundreds of gig into terabytes. And the challenge with that is, as individuals, I may not be able to go find a 10, 20, 30 terabyte hard drive to be able to run my node, to be able to support the space of a bloated blockchain that is processing 25, 30,000 transactions per second and matching that of Visa, which means all of a sudden you don't get the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. You no longer have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of node runners, individuals such as myself, and I'm not sure about you, Dale, who do run their own node.
No, I do not. I was exposed by Jeff. I am currently procuring one, so I'm sorry, everyone.
And so that is one of the huge benefits of Bitcoin right now is, and I don't quite know what the size of the blockchain is. I think it's about 700 gig is what I think the blockchain is. Don't quote me on that. But that 700 gig means you can have a 1 terabyte hard drive, and anyone in the world, as long as you have a 1 terabyte hard drive, can run your own node. And as an individual, you can choose the direction that Bitcoin goes. So you can vote by choosing the software you want to run. So you have a say in the decentralized democratic process of Bitcoin. That is profound. And the more people we have involved in that, the less chance we have of controlling structures taking advantage. Whereas the flip side is that if we increase our block size on the base chain, all of a sudden that the memory requirement to be able to run a node is going to swell to the point where maybe instead of having hundreds of thousands of nodes or tens of thousands of nodes, we only have 100 nodes. And so the democratic decentralized nature is starting to be skewed. The democratic decentralized nature is being compromised, and it allows for changes to take place that may not be in the best interest of the populace. And so I would say that when it comes to Bitcoin and scalability, you've got to think in layers. And this is how we look at many things throughout society. It's even how our current monetary system functions. When you look at, say, the central banks communicating with one another, they don't communicate through just sending back and forth a little wire transfer. They use the Fedwire system. That Fedwire system you can think of as the base layer of money. They're transferring millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars per transaction. And then above that, you've got the banks and the interbank transfers. Then you've got the SWIFT system. And so they're transferring thousands, if not tens of thousands. And then above that, you've started to get personal accounts. In Canada, we've got Interact e-transfers. You've just got little basic bank transfers. You've got credit cards, debit cards, you name it. Above that, you've got gift cards. And so no one layer is a perfect solution. As you move up the layers, you reduce security and privacy in the case of Bitcoin. But at the same time, you get ease of use. You get increased speed of transactions, you get increased throughput of transactions. And so I would say when it comes to Bitcoin and its ability to scale, we are scaling. We're seeing things like Lightning taking place. We've got Liquid, which is a side chain. We've got ways that we are starting to take advantage of increased throughput that are meeting the needs of day-to-day users. And the last point that I'll make is that if we want to try and use Bitcoin base layer to buy a coffee, it's never going to work. It's totally unfeasible. And so that's where I truly do believe that we need to have something like Lightning and other options built up on top of Bitcoin to be able to make Bitcoin a viable option for a global currency.
Absolutely. Just to sort of zoom in on a couple of points you made there, for folks perhaps if there were some aspects not 100% clear. Our banks are not talking to each other tens of thousands of times a day. And then things like credit cards are the ultimate form of convenience, but there is no final settlement. So Bitcoin is sort of that final settlement layer. And then with the credit card, you'd be looking at it, you go like, well, you've got up to like 60 days in some instances to dispute whether or not that charge actually took place. And it's not as if that transaction is finally settled until that period has elapsed. And so in that instance, we have the speed of transaction, but we don't have finality of the transaction. So it would be the equivalent of saying, hey, I can't pay for my coffee using Bitcoin. Saying, well, like it's like doing a bank transfer. It's like, are you going to sit there in the line and go, hey, man, can I have your bank details? And then I need that to actually clear. And that might take a business day or two. So it's wholly unsuitable for that. And I think what I also tell people generally is that Bitcoin is this emergent money, and it necessarily goes through the process where it first has to become an established store of value. And so there is that sort of volatility piece, but it is not really ready as a medium of exchange for the most part. And that is going to necessarily be built on layers, much like the internet is built on. Yeah, I think I've rattled on about that enough. I think you were probably more articulate on me.
No, and I think you added some really key points just to tie it back to the fact that you can never have a perfect solution that scales endlessly. And to be honest, even when you look at cryptocurrencies, and Jeff Booth talks about this, the blockchain trilemma, and it's basically this triangle where you've got scalability, decentralization, and security. And you can only really pick two of those sides. And so when it comes to Bitcoin, what we have focused on is that security and decentralization, recognizing that that scalability doesn't need to be met on the base layer. Instead, we can meet it on layers above that base layer through the Lightning Network, you name it, because we don't need to transact and send a coffee on the freaking base layer. The fees are way too expensive and the settlement time is too slow. But as we start to move up those layers, we can have almost instantaneous transaction times with very low fees.
And then it kind of goes back to that point of decentralization, because if the criticism of Bitcoin is that it's failed because it's not fast enough to come buy coffee, then I'll go, but hey, look at my blockchain, whether it's XRP or, that you name it. Then you start going, well, why do I even need this? I've actually got the fiat financial system. It works. I can go and just tap my card. It's a pretty seamless experience. I don't need your token that you've printed out of thin air and allocated to yourself and venture capital friends. All right. I think those are the main sort of fun things I wanted to touch on. There were a couple areas that I wanted to close off with today. And we're going to hopefully take a little bit of a controversial twist here, Seb. So, one thing I've noticed, and this is something again within Bitcoiners, is people criticizing each other for wanting to monetize their passion, for wanting to add value to people, charging for their time. And to me, it really baffles me because it's like you go to a physiotherapist, you pay for an accountant, you pay for a lawyer, you pay for all these things. But if someone's like, hey, can I help you can I help onboard you? Can I teach you something about how security works? Can I help you set up a wallet? Can I help you with UTXO consolidation? Here's my rate. And then people in the comments will be like, I'll do that for free. And, we shouldn't be charging and blah, blah, blah. I'm being kind of kind to them. But to me, I'm just like, dude, what is going on here? Like, you're contributing positively to the space. So have you got any thoughts in relation to that? And is this just kind of a natural reaction to, I guess, folks who are more ideological than sort of commercial or pragmatic?
It's an interesting one. When I kind of think about Bitcoin, as I tend to think about these pro free market, pro competition, pro value creation. And the interesting thing is, I've come across exactly what it is that you're talking about, whereby people start to monetize and they're just like, that's not the ethos of Bitcoin. We want to educate. And it's just like, yes, I think education and being able to give your services for free is admirable. But the reality is, it's still a free market. People still need to survive. And if we want Bitcoin to be a sustainable, viable solution moving forwards, then we have to create jobs in the community. And if we want to create jobs in the community, well, then people have to start charging for these things. And I think that what is interesting is that in the fiat world, so many of these privileges that we get that seem free are not really free. Like, we may get a free bank account, we're not paying for that bank account, but unfortunately, the reality is that the money that we're depositing in that bank account is being used on behalf of the bank, however it is that they deem necessary. So they're benefiting from our deposit. When it comes to social media, we've got a free Facebook account, we've got a free Twitter account, we've got a free Instagram account. But again, as I say, if you're not paying for the service, then you're the product. And unfortunately, they're taking advantage of our data and capitalizing off our data. The nice thing about Bitcoin is that when people start paying for a service, all of a sudden what it means is, one, value is being created in the community. You're now starting to support a viable future for Bitcoin. If people are able to support themselves, then they can continue to add value to the community. And two, if you're paying for the service, then you're probably not the product, which is unfortunately what the fiat system is doing. If you're not paying for something, that doesn't mean it's free. They're capitalizing off you in some other way. And I think it's important for people to kind of step back and realize that. But outside of that, I wholeheartedly believe that if you're a Bitcoiner and you're in the space, then you should, and you're able to create value enough that you can charge for your services, then by all means, go and do that. If you're taking advantage of your customers, I also believe in a free market, and that will show through in time, and you will lose customers and people won't direct capital towards you. But I do believe that the free market in the long run is always right. Capital flows towards those that are actually creating value. And if you're creating value, then by all means, I think you're deserving of that capital.
Absolutely. That's very well said. I think, yeah, so few Bitcoiners would be anti-free market, but then would have the view that people shouldn't be charging for their time. And there might be people who are taking advantage, and I might not like the actual individuals themselves, which I guess is a sort of side issue. But ultimately, the market will tell us what's true. And if people are exploiting folks who are just ignorant coming into the space, then over time, over a long enough time horizon, you'll find that people who are actually adding value at a better rate will just slowly attract those customers away. So yeah, I'm a big fan of anyone who puts themselves out there by positively contributing to Bitcoin, because there's no marketing department. We do all this,
Mm-hmm.
keep us on the back of our own efforts, and it's without much reward. But then once people do want to capitalize on perhaps some exposure they've received, the work they've done, I have absolutely no qualms. So I think the only proviso would be that whatever you're promoting, whatever you're selling, it has to be in alignment with the ethos of Bitcoin. Like, I would probably struggle to have respect for, and I'd want people to have a lack of respect for me if I started promoting shitcoin casinos, as an example, brought to you by Binance. That's never going to happen. You know what I mean? They're like, we're done. So yeah, that's a great point, Seb. I'm very conscious of avoiding groupthink within Bitcoin. Whenever I find myself within an in-group, I start instinctively trying to find ways to put myself on the outside. It's just my
Mhm.
nature. I call myself a lone wolf. I'm not a sheep. Do you have a controversial view in Bitcoin that you would like to share with us that perhaps you haven't outlined before?
Controversial view in Bitcoin that I have not outlined before. I wouldn't say this is like a true viewpoint, but we were having this discussion the other day and we were talking about Peter Schiff. And what was interesting is a lot of individuals, or people have probably heard the saying that, like, if you want to try and hide and you're like a notorious individual, you just hide in plain sight. And so sometimes I wonder if first off, believe that Peter Schiff 100% owns Bitcoin and is just kind of engagement farming in order to be able to gain more awareness. And if he knows that Bitcoin is inevitable, then it's in his best interest to engagement farm and try and keep the price low so he can accumulate more Bitcoin. But two, what if Peter Schiff is actually Satoshi? He's the individual that is trying to hide in plain sight. If he's out there constantly pushing out there, no one's ever going to suspect a thing. But maybe he's Satoshi, and so maybe that's my controversial viewpoint that Peter Schiff is Satoshi.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. I mean, look, I never took him for a cryptographer, but I do love that take of like I think he's trolling us. I don't think that he can. I mean, I think he's sufficiently wealthy to at least go like, look, just in case this thing takes off, maybe I should have a little slice of it. And he's known about it for a very long time. And it wouldn't surprise me if he regrets not buying it at $1 or $10
I
or
think he said there was a Pomp podcast once where his first tweet or something, and don't quote me on this again. It was something like Bitcoin was trading at around in the hundreds or in the low thousands, and he said that, of course, I regret not buying Bitcoin. I'd be a hell of a lot wealthier right now. And it's tough because as individuals, we can become very stuck in our belief patterns whereby we think the world works a certain way. And so all of a sudden, when the world doesn't work that way, it's devastating to us and our ego to realize that. And so as an individual, sometimes instead we just close off and we just dismiss it. And I think we've seen this so many times with Bitcoin, where someone, oh, I had the opportunity to buy Bitcoin at this price, or my brother was buying Bitcoin at this price. And the reality is that unfortunately, you didn't buy Bitcoin at that price. And at some point, if Bitcoin, which I do believe it will, but if it continues going on the path that it is going on, you will be buying Bitcoin. It's just going to be a hell of a lot higher in the future. So it's better just to be able to own up to this kind of belief structure that has impeded your ability to see Bitcoin as it is and look at it objectively, because you can take advantage of it now.
it's something I've again said many times on the show. It's more of like an EQ test, humility test, as opposed to an IQ test. There's so many smart people out there, but often it's those who are so deeply entrenched. Their ideology, their identity is so intrinsically tied up with the current financial system. You know, I'd be referring to fund managers, money managers, investment managers, all those guys, financial advisors. They've got a way of thinking, and I think it's going to be very hard to penetrate those folks. I think
Mhm.
you're naturally, and this is how Bitcoin has evolved. It started off with sort of criminals. Well, first the cypherpunks mucking around, just sending it back and forth, having fun, not really having any intrinsic value. Then the free market sort of started putting a value on it, and then people started buying, you know, guns and porn and doing whatever the hell and drugs and whatever they wanted to do. And then slowly it's encompassing a bigger and bigger cohort. But I suspect there's a lot of people in mainstream finance that are really late because their whole worldview depends on their job. I was shocked to discover that so many financial advisors, the subtotal of what they actually do in terms of advice is something along the lines of, what's your age? There's okay, cool. There's your age. I'm going to just put you across these 5 ETFs, and then I'll just chuck in a bit of a bond ETF. And oh, by the way, it's 1%. And it's like, what a joke. That's not a real job. You're just taking other people's products and bundling them together. And it strikes me that those guys are not going to be the first in line just to sell Bitcoin.
You
Yeah,
know what? I was just going to mention one quick point, which is the fact that unfortunately, through evolution, we've up until basically the last 150 years, we have lived in small little hunter gatherer communities. And so, if we were to be kicked out of our small little community, we would basically die. We would have to fend for ourselves, and it'd be almost impossible. And so, the challenge is through evolution, we have developed this adaptation where we want to conform, we want to fit in, because otherwise we risk survival. And that is still playing through today, whereby when you are a pension fund manager, when you are a financial advisor and you're in your small little community and all of a sudden you bring up something like Bitcoin, you get slammed to the point where you could lose your job and hey, don't mention that at work. Unfortunately, we get groupthink, to your point earlier. You get groupthink where people cannot think for themselves. And unfortunately, they believe they kind of form these belief structures that impede them from seeing Bitcoin as it really is. And so more than anything, what I really value about the Bitcoin community is the majority of individuals that I've met, they question. And they don't just question Bitcoin, they question everything around them. And I think questioning and asking why is so important for us to be able to hopefully see reality as it is and identify truth underlying things.
Yes, yes, amen. That is exactly what I love about Bitcoiners. Sometimes people go a little bit off the reservation in terms of questioning everything, but I still love them because, to be honest, I love free-spirited, independent thinking people. I struggle with people and I struggle to identify with people who are very much compliant. Yes, sir, no, sir. What did the government tell me? Okay, that sounds fantastic. What do these people say? Okay, that's true. Like really trying to understand what is true in the world. It's not to say you're always going to get it right. And it's not to say I agree with everything that I guess those kind of folks do, but fundamentally, I love free-spirited, independent thinking people, and I think it's what binds a lot of us Bitcoiners together, man. On that lovely note, I would like to draw this conversation to a close. It's been superb, and to sort of re-echo something I said a bit earlier, I love that you've also written a book. It's a monumental effort, and it's got such great critical acclaim. You were on Preston Pisher's podcast, crying out loud, and it was one of his favorite books, he said. So kudos to you, man. And I've also got your Beers for Bitcoin book, which I highly recommend to beginners. So yeah, thanks for all the great work you do in the space. And I'm glad to see you finally getting the recognition after all that proof of work. Is there any way you want to direct people to learn a bit more about what you do and where they can find some of your content?
For sure. And honestly, Dale, I truly appreciate you having me on. I apologize. I've got like 2 hours sleep last night, so I feel a little like wrecked. And so hopefully I didn't waffle on in some of my responses.
Yeah, you were
But
great. Thanks.
honestly, I really appreciate having me on. I really value your takes on things, and I really value just the humility and the way that you communicate and the points you add. If people want to kind of learn more, one, you can just kind of check out the book, which is on Amazon and in most jurisdictions, which is just The Hidden Cost of Money. And then you can also, if you want to learn more about kind of education and digging into the macroeconomic world we live in, Bitcoin, you name it, check out Looking Glass Education, which I founded with Daz B and Greg Foss and a couple others. And all of our content on there is free and accessible. And then finally, and I just took a role in the last, when was it? And since February, as kind of educator for a company based out of Canada called Block Rewards. And we do compensation and rewards on a Bitcoin standard. And so it's called Block Rewards. And we're helping people get paid in Bitcoin, which I think is so freaking important. Because I think the more people that can put a portion of their wages into Bitcoin, I think the greater capacity they have as their purchasing power increases to show up how they want to. And kind of circling back to that point at the very start of the podcast, which is I think not enough of us listen to who am I and how do I want to show up in the world. And so I think when it comes to, for me personally, when I'm traveling and having these opportunities, I feel so humbled and I feel so grateful. But as I'm traveling, I'm trying to listen in and say, hey, what is it that motivates me? What is it that drives me? Who am I and how do I want to show up? And I think what is so cool about Bitcoin is that ultimately, if our purchasing power is increasing moving forward, so we have greater capacity to spend time with our kids, reduce their work output, you name it, we have a greater capacity to show up authentically. And I think Bitcoin is incredible. I think Bitcoin truly is incredible.
Dude, that's exactly why I Bitcoin. I can envision an incredible future. And not only have I met some incredible people along the way, but I'm painting a picture in my mind of where I'm going to be in 10 years' time. And it's magnificent. That's why I encourage people to start saving a portion of your savings in Bitcoin and just leaving it. And the more optionality I think you'll have in the future to be you, to do what you want with your life. Because I think so few people, unfortunately, have that opportunity where they can live life on their own terms. And
100%. The ironic part about Bitcoin as money is that ultimately it gets us to forget about money. Because I think the fiat system, unfortunately, just constantly pushes money on us. We're constantly stuck under the burden of debt and pushed to consume more and get the newest shoes and do this and do that. And Bitcoin ultimately it allows us to show up how we want to. And I think that is profound. Thanks a lot, Dale.
awesome, man. Take care.